How to sew the patch pouch, part of the Just Fat 8 series of instructions. This handy pouch can be made using small fabric squares or one whole piece. Cutting out. You can make the patch pouch from one piece of fabric, or if you prefer, you can make a patchwork version. If you want to make a patchwork version, then join together the squares using the measurements in the instructions and the arrangement. But the pouches are made in the same way whether you use the patchwork or the whole fabric. If you're using just one piece of fabric, trace and cut out the template from your instructions and place it at the top of the piece of fabric that you've cut for the pouch outer. This is because you need to get the front outer and the back outer from one piece of fabric. So if you're using a whole piece of fabric, pin the template to the top. Obviously, if you've decided to do the patched version, you will be placing this centrally on top of your patched piece. And again, the measurements and the details for creating the patchwork are all in the instructions. Once you've pinned it into place, then you can cut round the template, and this makes the pouch front outer. So put quite a few pins in because you've obviously got sloped edges, you've got cut out corners, and it's important that you cut it out accurately. So you can see here, in order to get the front and the back from the one piece of fabric, I've placed this at the top. So cut carefully around the template. And then once you've done that, use the same template to cut another piece for the pouch back outer, and then also 2 pieces for the lining. They're all used the same template, and you'll need to cut a little piece for the zip tab. If you've done the patched version, you can see here I've cut out the patch version using the template. Inserting the zip. Place the pouch front outer right sides up, and then mark it 3/4 inch to the right of the left hand side of the top edge. If you're making the patch pouch, obviously you'll have the patch section, but I'm going to show you just using the one whole piece of fabric. Then mark it 1 inch in from the right hand side. Now take your zip and undo it and place it right sides down on top, so that the top edge of the zip tape is right sides facing with the top edge. Now fold the edge of the end of the zip upwards. So you can see that little metal zip stop, that's going to be in the bottom corner, so place it upwards. That little metal zip stop needs to sit on that 3/4 inch mark that you've just made. Pin the zip tape into place at the top so that the edge of the zip tape matches the raw edge of the fabric. Just double check with your tape measure that that little metal zip top is 3/4 inch in from the left hand side edge. Once you're happy that it is, then pin the tape into place along the top, matching the edge of the zip tape with the raw edge of the fabric. Now mark on the zip tape that 1 inch mark that you put underneath. You can measure again if you like, but it needs to be 1 inch from the side. Now tack this zip into place, starting from the left but stopping at that 1 inch mark. Tack it within the seam allowance. Now take the lining, so this is the pouch front lining, and place it right sides down on top. Pin it into place, matching up the raw edges, so the zip is now sandwiched between the outer and the lining. And pin it into place at the other end, and then pin it into place in the centre. Make sure the raw edges are matching. You can see the little end of the zip tab sticking up, the zip tape sticking up. Now measure and mark 1 inch in from the right hand side and 3/4 inch. So you can see the first measurement from the right hand side is 3/4 inch, the second is 1 inch, so you've got 1/4 inch between them. Now this is where you're going to leave a little gap so that you have a really nice neat zip. So the second section you're not going to sew in. I'll show you in a minute. If you start from the left hand side, sew all the way along to that first mark. Either lock stitch or do a little reverse stitch at this point, then take it out from under your machine. Pull the zip out of the way just like I'm doing here, and pin the lining and the outer back together so that the zip tape isn't in there at all, it's facing downwards. Then start at this second mark and stitch to the end. The zip will then be loose in that little 1/4 inch gap you've left. So it will look like this once it's sewn. So you can see that the zip is loose. Do make sure that you haven't sewn it into that second seam, but that 1/4 inch gap you left will help this to happen. Now, place the two pieces wrong sides facing and close the zip, because we're now going to sew the other side. You do it in the same way, but almost back to front. So take the lining, so this is the back lining, and place it right sides up. And measure and mark 3/4 inch in from the left-hand side. This is exactly like you did with when you put the other side of the zip in. And then measure and mark 1 inch in from the right-hand side. All of these measurements are in your instructions, so you don't need to remember them. Just refer to the instructions for much more detail on the measurements. If you use the instructions in the video together, you'll find it a lot easier. Now take the zip tape, this time fold it underneath. So if you look here, you can see the end of the zip is underneath. And pin it into place. And again, that little metal zip stop will be in the bottom corner of it. Now, just like you did with the front, but this time the zip is right sides up, place the little metal zip stop on that 3/4 inch mark. But you can see that this time the zip is right sides up on top of the right side of the back lining. And then pin it into place all the way along. Make sure the edge of the zip tape matches up with the end of the top of the lining. Now mark that 1 inch mark, just double check and mark that on the zip tape. Now sew all the way along the top, or tack it and stop at that 1 inch mark. Remember, you tack it within the seam allowance, and then it will look like this. So take the back outer and place that right sides down on top. Undo the zip first, it's just a bit easier. Match up the raw edge of the outer and the lining with the zip sandwiched in between, and pin it together all the way along. You're going to sew this into place in exactly the same way as we did with the front, leaving that little 1/4 inch gap. So to start with, just pin it into place all the way along, and then measure and mark 1 inch in from the right hand side, and then 1/4 inch in from the right hand side. So you can see you've got that little 1/4 inch gap left. Now sew the 3 layers all the way together up to the first mark, reverse or lock stitch, take it out from under your machine, fold the zip downwards, repin the outer to the lining, and then start at the second mark, reverse a stitch with that again, and then to the end to do 2 seams. Once that's done, it will look like this. So the zip is hanging nice and loose and free with that little 1/4 inch gap. That makes it much neater. You can now close the zip and it's neatly inserted. It's worth taking a bit of time now to press the outer and the lining. Now, normally when you put a zip in a zip pouch, you would top stitch at this stage, but we're not going to do that. We do that at the end. You'll see why when we create it, but it's easier to do it at the end. So to start with now, just press those seams open. So where you've got the seam between the zip and the lining and the outer, press those seams open. And the reason we're doing this is that it's easier to get a nice, neat, pressed open seam at this stage. And it also makes when you top stitch at the very end a lot easier. So just open up those seams and press them open. I know it's a little bit fiddly because it's only a 1/4 inch seam, but it is worth doing. Then once that's done, place the outer and the lining wrong sides facing of the front and the outer lining of the back wrong sides facing, and lay them out flat so the raw edges match. And then that second seam, the seam that you've got either side of the zip, you need that seam to be laying right on the edge. So just arrange it so that you can see there the seam is laying right on the edge now. And then at the other side, make sure that seam, because you've got a seam joining the outer and the lining either side of the zip. This is what gives you that open wide pouch look, means that you can open the zip beyond the edge of the pouch, and it makes it easier to get things inside. So this is why you have seams either side of the zip. So give that a nice press, that's done. Assembling the pouch. Now your zip is inserted, you can sew the outers and the linings together. So place the 2 outer pieces right side facing and place the 2 lining pieces right sides facing. You need to open the zip halfway so that we can turn it right sides out later, and take the loose end of the zip tape and place that on the inside so that you don't sew through it when you're sewing these pieces together. So match up the bottom seams of the outer and pin them together all the way along, making sure the raw edges match. Then pin together down the sides. Again, make sure all the raw edges are, because there's lots of different shapes and angles, so just make sure they match up and pin them together. When you reach the seam that joins the outer to the lining, fold the seam on one side in one direction and the seam on the other side in the other direction. It just helps to nest them and the seams will match up better. So pin them together at the seam, and then you can pin the outer to the left of it and the lining to the right of it. Again, match up all those raw edges. Then pin together across the base of the lining. So start by pinning it together. We're going to leave a turning gap unstitched in this seam so that we can turn the pouch right sides out. And this turning gap needs to be in the centre. So to make sure that it is, measure and mark the halfway point, and then measure 1.5 inches either side of this halfway point. And that means that you've marked a 3-inch gap in the centre of this edge. If you place vertical pins either side of this turning gap, then you'll remember to leave this unstitched. Now pin together down the other side. Start off by matching up the seam. Again, make sure that those seam allowances are facing in opposite directions, but do make sure that the seam that you've got on top is facing the same way as the top seam at the other end. So you can see on this one it's facing to the left, so do make sure that it's facing to the left on the other side, otherwise your seam will be twisted in the centre. Once you've pinned it together at the centre, pin it together down the side of both the lining and the outer, again matching the raw edges. And now you can sew it together. So start one side of the turning gap. Don't sew round the box corners, sew down the side. When you get to the seam, pivot with your needle in the seam, lift the presser foot, turn and stitch down the other side. Don't sew round the box corner, go along the bottom seam, not round the box corner, down the other side. Again, when you reach the seam, put the needle down, pivot, put the presser foot back down and stitch down there. It just helps to get a neater edge. Don't sew around the box corner and then sew up to the other side of the turning gap. And then this is what it will look like when you've sewn it all the way. So you can see how I've stopped and pivoted at those seams. You get a nicer angle. Now for the turning gap, which is at the bottom of the lining, press this seam open by just folding it over to the front and then turn it over and fold the other side. By turning and pressing the turning gap over on both sides, it just helps when you're sewing it closed later. And then repeat that just to press the seams open all the way around. Obviously you can't press them open, but if you press the top seam allowance over, like I'm showing you here, this works in a similar way to pressing it open. Again, this method of doing this will help to get the seams to lay exactly on the edge when you finish your pouch later. When you're sewing it together, do make sure that you don't sew through that zip tape that's loose. You can see it poking out of the corner there. So you'll soon know if you do sew over it, because you'll notice the difference in thickness, but just do make sure that you don't sew over it, because that end needs to stay loose. So once you've pressed the seams open, you now need to box the corners. To do this, place the side seam and the base seam of each corner, right sides facing, matching up the seam allowance. Again, you will need to pivot at the seam and then go down the other side, because these box corners are slightly angled because of the triangular shape of the pouch. So you can see I've boxed the 4 outers and linings. Finishing the pouch. Turn the pouch right sides out by easing it through the turning gap, and then slip stitch or top stitch that turning gap closed just like I've done here. Push the lining back inside the outer, pushing out the bottom corners so they meet up and the lining sits neatly inside. Now press the top edge so that the seam lays right on the edge. Because you pressed this open early, you'll find this a lot easier. And then top stitch all the way around the edge, making sure you don't top stitch through these loose ends of the zip. All in one go, and then you will have a neat top stitched edge and just holds the zip in place, and the end of the zip is loose. Now to give the pouch the shape, take the bottom of one corner, pinch it, and the bottom of the other corner and pinch it, and then lay it flat on your ironing board and give it a press from one corner to the other. This gives the pouch a little bit more structure and helps it to sit flat. Do this on the other side. Take one corner and the other corner, lay them flat and press from one corner to the other. And this creates the base section of the pouch. Because it's triangular, the base is bigger than the top so that you can fit lots inside. Adding the zip tab. Close the zip fully. This is really important so that you don't cut off the wrong end. So make sure it's fully closed and then measure and mark on your zip 2 inches from the side, from where the side seam is on the zip to further along. So it basically means that you've got 2 inches of zip sticking out from the side seam. So measure the 2 inches from that seam. Put another mark on the top so you can see that it's straight. And then cut off the zip. This is why it's important that the zip is fully closed. So cut off the end of the zip and you can discard that extra piece. And then work a few machine stitches across the teeth to secure. Now to make the zip tab, take the long edge, one of the long edges, and turn it over by 1/4 of an inch to the wrong side. If you measure 1/2 an inch from the raw edge, like I'm doing here, and then fold the raw edge to meet up with that pin, then you have measured and fold it over by exactly 1/4 of an inch. This is the end of the zip tab that will sit closest to the zip teeth. So this will be the top of the zip tab, if you need to know that for print direction. Give that a little press. You can finger press it or do it with your iron. You can take the pins out now. Now fold this zip tab in half, right sides facing, you can see here, so that the folded under edges are meeting up and the short edge meets up. Pin it together and sew together to make a little tube. Once the tube is sewn, open it up, put your finger inside, open it up and refold it so that seam is lying in the centre, and then press it if you want to make sure it's exact, and then pin it together so the seam is lying in the centre, then sew together across the end to close the tube. Once you've done that, to remove a little the bulk, because this is only a little zip tab, trim off the bottom corners, take care not to cut the stitching, and then trim a little bit off those top corners. Those are the tops of the folded under edges. Again, it just reduces bulk. Once that's done, turn your little tab right sides out. You can just do this with your fingers. But you need to make sure now that the corners of this zip tab lay right in the edge. So use a tool, something not too pokey. I've used the wooden stick from my turning tubes, which is quite useful to push out the corners, but just make sure you don't pierce the fabric, and then run the stick along the seam to make sure it lies right on the edge. And then give your zip tab a little press. Now take the end of your zip tape and place it inside the little tab. So the seamed part of the tab needs to sit on the bottom of the zip and the unseamed bit needs to sit on the top. So it's like a little pocket and the zip will fit inside with a little bit of allowance so you can actually get it in. Now pin it together across the bottom just to hold it so the zip is sandwiched between, and then sew it together in a square all the way around. This now finishes off the end of your zip tab, and by using a fabric that matches your pouch, it makes a nice little finishing touch. So that's your pouch now finished. If you open the zip, it opens up nice and wide so you can get to everything inside. The bottom of the pouch is wider than the top so that it allows lots inside, and it's just a nice design detail. If you've made the patch pouch, this is what it will look like. The angle corner gives a really nice effect to the squares of the pouch, and again, if you open it up, it's fully lined on the inside, and close it again, and you've got a beautiful pair of little pouches.